At 67 years old, Anita Baker should be drifting through the kind of peace reserved for legends, her name spoken softly, her catalog treated like sacred ground. Instead, her story opens with paperwork, accusations, and another courtroom door closing behind her back. Not long ago, her own attorney was telling reporters that his client had been wrongly accused of stiffing a local painter out of more than $15,000. According to later reports, that same attorney would claim Anita now owed him thousands as well. One more bill, one more dispute, one more headline that treated her life as a case file instead of a human being. When she spoke to a local journalist on the phone, Anita was described as shaken, emotional, and deeply thankful to the judge who had just given her a small measure of relief. On that call, with her voice low and unsteady, she reportedly said she had never gone through anything like this before and was finally ready to defend herself now that she actually knew what she was being sued for. By this age, Anita Baker should have been wrapped in the warm glow of tribute shows and lifetime achievement segments. Her name should have floated through award ceremonies like a prayer. But around her legacy now, there is a different kind of air, colder, heavier. There are whispers, court dates, online arguments. It is as if the very industry she helped shape has slowly turned its back, edging her story toward the shadows while the spotlight moves on. Most people think they know her. They think of the velvet tone, the slow-burning romance, the poised woman in immaculate gowns, the queen of quiet storm. They know the album covers, the late-night radio staples, the wedding songs. But Anita's real story lives far from the stage lights. It lives in the childhood she never truly escaped. It lives in the first time she was left behind, in the second time she was orphaned, and in the betrayal she was said to have endured once she finally made it to the music industry's inner rooms. It lives in the tax notices, the court summons, the contracts she fought to interpret, and the rights she spent years trying to reclaim over songs she had practically carved out of her own lungs. And then there was 2023. One reunion tour, one show, one tweet. In a matter of hours, decades of goodwill were threatened as the internet tried to recast Anita Baker not as a survivor or a pioneer, but as the villain of a story she didn't write. But none of that makes sense unless you go back to the first wound. Her tragedy did not begin with a painter's invoice or a trending hashtag. It did not start at 67. It began long before the fame, on a day when a baby girl was treated as expendable. Before Anita Baker became the woman whose ballads defined late-night radio, she was a child the world had already decided to throw away, not once, but twice. That is the part of her life that record labels never put in press kits. It is the piece of history even Anita has rarely explored in detail publicly, and yet it explains almost everything that came after. The beloved songs, the constant tension, the perfection that bordered on obsession, the bursts of anger, the isolation, the need to control every detail, none of it is random. It all points back to the same origin. Anita Denise Baker entered the world on the 26th of January 1958 in Toledo, Ohio. Before she could string full sentences together, her life had already cracked apart. Her biological mother, a young woman barely older than a child herself, reportedly handed Anita to relatives and walked away from her newborn daughter's life for good. No regular visits, no long, apologetic letters, no halfway promises to someday come back. Anita has said in interviews that she never knew her biological father and had almost no real relationship with her birth mother after that moment. That silence was the first injury, a wound that didn't bleed on the outside but never stopped aching beneath the surface. She was taken to Detroit, a city heading into one of the most volatile and unforgiving chapters in modern American history. There, she was raised by her mother's cousin, Mary Lewis, and Mary's husband, Walter. In that small household, Anita finally experienced some structure, warmth, and the fragile feeling of belonging. For the first time, she had people she could call Mom and Dad, even if biology told a different story. But no matter how carefully Mary folded her clothes or how firmly Walter tried to anchor the family, Anita lived with a truth she could not outrun. The people tucking her in at night were not the ones who brought her into the world, and the woman who did bring her here had chosen to live without her. Children don't need vocabulary to understand abandonment. They recognize it in the way a door closes and never opens again. They recognize it in the empty chair at birthdays, in the names that are never spoken. For a time, Mary fought to keep Anita close to something steady. She made sure the girl went to church, stayed rooted in choir stands, and kept her distance from the streets that were swallowing so many young black children in Detroit in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Outside, the city was tightening like a fist. Factories were beginning to shut down. Jobs evaporated. Tensions between police and black residents escalated year after year. The anger, poverty, and frustration built toward a breaking point. In 1967, when Anita was still a child, Detroit exploded into one of the deadliest urban uprisings in American history. Fires burned through neighborhoods not far from where she was struggling to grow up. Sirens cut through the night. Smoke hung in the air. The world outside her windows looked like it was falling apart. Inside that modest home, there was at least love. Until there wasn't. By the time Anita reached 12, tragedy arrived again, swift and merciless. Mary Lewis, the woman who had taken her in and given her a sense of family, died. Soon after, Walter Lewis passed away as well. 2 funerals, 2 graves, 2 more goodbyes. And the girl who had already been abandoned once was suddenly orphaned all over again. She went to live with her foster sister, Lois Land. But by then, something inside Anita had already fractured in a way that could not be fully repaired. Most children dream about who they might become. Anita spent those years wondering if everyone who loved her was destined to leave. This overlooked chapter of her biography is the key that unlocks everything the public never really understood about her, even as they played her records on repeat. The fear of being left, the urgency in her love songs, the way danger and desperation flicker beneath the softness of her vibrato. She did not sing about heartbreak because it was poetic. She sang about it because it was the only language her life had taught her consistently. When Anita discovered music, she did not treat it like a hobby or even a career path. She treated it like a lifeline. The church choirs where she first learned to control that extraordinary voice were more than creative outlets. They were safe houses. In those aisles and pews, she was protected from the chaos in the streets, from the uncertainty of home, from the gnawing terror that she could be discarded yet again. Her future fans would one day hear warmth, romance, and elegance in her tone. But if you listen closely to those early, raw performances, the unpolished recordings, the rehearsal tapes, you can almost hear something else trembling underneath. A quiet panic wrapped in melody. A constant ache hidden in every sustained note. It is the sound of someone singing like their life depends on it. Later, critics would describe Anita's voice as luxurious and refined, perfect for candlelit evenings and slow dances. What many missed was the darker truth. That voice did not arise from comfort or security. It was forged in loss. It belonged to a girl who had learned too soon that the world would not catch her if she fell, that love could vanish overnight, and that the only thing she could truly rely on was her own breath. Her childhood was not just hard. It was the blueprint that shaped and sometimes shattered everything that came after. The future lawsuits, the mistrust of corporations, the obsession with ownership, the need to control every detail in the studio, the fear of betrayal, the perfectionism that bordered on self-punishment, none of it can be understood without returning to that little girl in Detroit. Back to the child the city nearly swallowed. Back to the daughter, abandoned twice. Back to the wound that eventually became her voice. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. If you follow the beginning of Anita Baker's ascent, you have to follow the beginning of her first collapse, because they arrive almost in the same frame. Her life does not move in a neat, upward line. It jumps like an old film reel, one scene dissolving into the next, each cut just a little darker than the one before. When the reel spins back to Detroit in the mid-1970s, the city looks less like a hometown and more like a war zone. Factories sit hollow and rusting. Storefronts are boarded up. Neon signs flicker over half-empty sidewalks, buzzing above nightclubs where hungry musicians gamble their youth on dimly lit stages. This is where we find Anita, 17 years old, standing in smoky bars with a cheap microphone in her hand. The rooms are packed with men twice her age. The lights above her blink because the wiring is older than the building itself. Glasses clink. Voices overlap. Laughter rises in messy waves. It is not a glamorous stage. It is survival with a cover charge. Then she sings. The moment she opens her mouth, the noise in the room seems to fall through a trapdoor. Conversations stop mid-sentence. Even the drunkest regulars turn toward the stage, eyebrows lifted, cigarettes frozen halfway to their lips. Something in her tone cuts through the haze, the grain in her voice, the ache in her phrasing, and for a few suspended seconds, the entire club seems to breathe in sync with her. That should have been the first undeniable clue. Anita Baker was never meant to stay in the background. As the years slide forward, the frame shifts to 1975. Anita gets the phone call that alters the course of her life. A quiet invitation to join Chapter 8, one of Detroit's most promising R&B bands. Suddenly, the girl who once sang to stay afloat is being asked to step into something bigger than weekend gigs and late-night sets. She throws herself into it. She rehearses until her throat is raw, records demos in small studios that smell like coffee and tape dust, rides in worn-out vans between cities where the hotel carpets all look the same. She fights through fatigue because for the first time she feels like she is moving out of crisis mode and into destiny. Then the timestamp flips to February 1979. Chapter 8 finally releases their debut album under Areola Records. On tracks like Ready for Your Love, Anita's vocals slip through speakers and into the ears of musicians, DJs, and producers who begin to whisper among themselves that the shy young singer might be something rare. A secret weapon, a future star. But the music business does not respond to whispers. It responds to spreadsheets. It runs on balance sheets and projections, not goosebumps. That is why the next scene lands like a punch to the chest. Later in 1979, Areola is acquired by Arista Records. Overnight, every artist on the roster turns into a folder on a conference table in a building far from Detroit. Executives who have never walked into one of Anita's clubs, who have never seen her hold a room in the palm of her hand, skim through contracts and sales figures and decide who is worth keeping. When they reach Chapter 8, their decision is fast and cold. The group is dropped. No appeal. No last meeting. No, let's revisit this next quarter. Just a clean cut through years of work. The real shock, though, comes when Anita hears the reason, whispered behind closed doors words she would later repeat in interviews, still stung by their cruelty. We don't see star potential in her. In that instant, it is as if the camera of her life jerks sharply to one side. The girl who grew up with the bruise of abandonment now hears one of the most powerful labels in the country dismiss her as expendable. Not because she cannot sing, not because audiences don't react, but because the industry at the end of the 1970 seconds is moving toward disco, crossover pop, and radio-friendly ballads designed to please white mainstream listeners. In that landscape, there is no place, at least in their calculations, for a young black woman whose voice is too soulful, too mature, too slow-burning to fit the shiny formula they want to sell. So while other acts are polished, promoted, and steered toward the spotlight, Anita's name is quietly erased from the label's future plans. The momentum she built collapses in a matter of meetings she's not even invited to attend. Humiliated and gutted, she does the only thing that seems possible in that moment. She walks away. By the time the reel clicks into 1980, Anita Baker is no longer standing in front of amplifiers or studio glass. She is back in Detroit, wearing office attire, sitting behind a desk as a receptionist at a law firm. She files documents. She transfers calls. She learns the rhythm of ringing phones and copy machines instead of drum machines and bass lines. During the day, she pretends the dream she carried for so long was childish, something she outgrew. At night, she goes home tired not just from the job, but from the effort it takes to keep the sound inside her from breaking loose. For a while, it looks like the executives were right. It looks like the world will never truly know the voice they saw as disposable, the voice that once silenced entire rooms. The dream appears to be shrinking down into a memory. But the irony is brutal and precise. The industry that tried to bury Anita Baker never understood what it was dealing with. She was not built to be thrown away. Her voice was not wired to dim just because someone in a distant office decided she wasn't marketable. Instead, the rejection pressed in on her like heat on metal, hardening her resolve, deepening her interpretation, sharpening every instinct she had. As the reel continues to spin, fate begins to realign in the background, setting up a reversal so powerful that the very same men who wrote her off in 1979 would soon have no choice but to listen. The tragedy is simple. The door was slammed in her face. The miracle is quieter. She learned how to build another door, and she would make the world walk through it. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. If Anita Baker's story were laid out like a crime documentary, this is the chapter where an investigator would step up to a corkboard, pin a contract in the center, circle a name in red ink, and say calmly, "Here, this is where the trap was set." Because long before Anita commanded arenas, long before Rapture rewired the sound of adult R&B, she walked straight into an agreement that nearly broke her. And the most unsettling detail is this. She walked into it with hope in her chest. She believed she was being rescued. After Arista Records slammed its door on her in 1979, Anita limped back to Detroit and tried to construct a normal life out of routine. But talent like hers does not quietly retire. It leaks through the cracks. By 1982, word was spreading through Detroit's tight-knit music circles about a rising executive named Otis Smith, the head of a small label called Beverly Glen Records. He was searching, people said, for a female vocalist with real emotional depth. Someone raw, different, someone who could give his young company credibility. When Otis heard Anita's demos, he didn't just dial her number, he pursued her. According to reports, he promised her creative input, transparency, and a label that would treat her like family. That word family hit Anita in the most vulnerable part of her history. She had been abandoned, ignored, cast aside. Now someone in the industry was telling her she was needed, valued, central. That was the first lie. In 1983, Anita signed her solo deal and began recording The Songstress. She poured everything she had into those sessions: grief, fear, gratitude, longing. She sang until her throat burned. She rewrote harmonies up to the last minute, pushed past exhaustion when no one asked her to, and carried the project like a personal mission. When the album was released later that year, it did exactly what Otis Smith had hoped. It worked. Songs like Angel and No More Tears earned heavy rotation on R&B radio. The record reportedly sold over 300,000 copies, enough to establish Anita as a rising force in the genre. On paper, this should have been the moment when everything turned in her favor. But as her name gained momentum, the cracks in the foundation started to show. While the album climbed and the phone requests increased, Anita's bank account did not reflect the success. The royalty statements she received did not match what she was seeing in the streets and hearing on the air. The numbers felt wrong. The percentages were unclear. The deductions were vague, sometimes inexplicable. Behind the scenes, decisions were being made without her. Marketing moves, distribution strategies, release plans, choices that had been framed as collaborations were, in reality, dictated by the label. The freedom she had been promised was nowhere to be found. When Anita started asking questions, what she got back was a familiar fog: delays, half-answers, and shifting explanations. Studio budgets were still processing. Payments were in calculation. Royalty breakdowns were pending further review. For many artists, this might be dismissed as just another case of industry exploitation. But Anita's life had already been carved by abandonment. This was not just about business. To her, it felt like betrayal. Then came the second lie. Beverly Glen never intended to let her go. As the songstress continued to grow, Anita was ready to move forward, to write new material, explore a new sound, upgrade her production, but the label began dragging its feet. Meetings were pushed, plans were postponed. Schedules were always being revised. Promises of next quarter, and after the distributors' finalized numbers piled up, Anita slowly started to see what was really happening. The delay tactics had little to do with logistics. They were about leverage. Beverly Glenn had discovered how valuable she truly was and did not want to risk losing her to a larger label with deeper pockets and more muscle. So they stalled, and stalled, and stalled. What Anita did not fully grasp at the time was that the contract she had signed hurriedly, trustingly, with minimal legal protection, had been structured to bind her tightly. She owed the label additional albums. She could not negotiate elsewhere freely. She could not move without their consent. And Beverly Glenn had no intention of granting that consent. By late 1984, Anita reached her breaking point. She had tasted success, but was still living like a struggling artist. No clear royalties, no transparency, no path forward. So she made the one move record companies dread the most. She sought legal help, not a major coastal law firm with 100 lawyers on call, but a smaller Detroit attorney who believed her and was willing to fight. When Beverly Glenn caught wind of her plans to leave, they moved first. The label sued Anita for breach of contract, insisting she still owed them recordings. In effect, they tried to drag her back into the cage and bolt the door. This is the chapter most casual fans never heard about. Anita Baker came dangerously close to losing her career in a courtroom before it had even had a chance to fully peak. She spent months traveling back and forth, waiting in narrow courthouse hallways, clutching a folder full of contracts she did not completely understand. In those moments, she was not Anita Baker. The Grammy-winning icon history would celebrate. She was a young black woman standing alone against a label with more money, more experience, and a system built to favor their side. Otis Smith was not just a record man, he was a tactician. He understood that delays could exhaust her, that legal fees could drain her, that the stress might push her to surrender. Stalling wasn't an accident, it was strategy, but Anita did not fold. In 1985, after a draining and relentless legal fight, the court ruled in her favor. She won the right to walk away. There was no parade, no dramatic speech, no champagne in the hallway, just signatures, a judge's decision, and the quiet relief of being unchained. It was enough. She was finally, officially free. And in a twist that almost feels too clean for fiction, the day she stepped out of that courtroom was the day the real Anita Baker started to emerge. Once she was legally clear of Beverly Glenn, Warner Elektra moved in quickly. They offered her what she had been denied for years: real budgets, top-tier musicians, proper promotion, and a level of creative control that let her build the exact sound she heard in her head. In March 1986, she released the album that changed everything, Rapture. Sweet Love, the song that would echo through decades, wedding halls, radio playlists, and quiet living rooms, came out of a freedom she had almost never secured. Had she lost that lawsuit, she might have remained trapped in a small label's basement, her voice muffled, her growth stunted. If that judge had ruled differently, Angel could have been her last major whisper into the public's ear, not the prelude to a legacy. If Anita had broken under the pressure, the world might never have heard Sweet Love, Caught Up in the Rapture, or any of the records that would come to define an era. Her entire legacy hung on a single legal decision. Which leads to one chilling conclusion. Before Anita Baker conquered R&B, she had to survive a blood-deep contract that was never designed to let her go. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. When the court finally untangled Anita Baker from Beverly Glenn, she didn't step out of that legal maze empty-handed. She carried something sharper than anger, an almost surgical kind of vengeance, the quiet determination of a perfectionist who had spent her whole life being underestimated. And just as she was set free, the world, for once, seemed ready to hear what she really had to say. The next turning point appears clearly stamped on the timeline, the 20th of March 1986. That's the day Rapture was released through Elektra. It wasn't just a successful album. It was a recalibration of black adult contemporary music. Rapture didn't just chart it, redrew the map. Sweet Love surged through radio stations, climbed the Billboard charts, and pulled Anita from Detroit's shadows straight into national focus. Almost overnight, the same industry that had once dismissed her as lacking star potential began quietly rewriting its own history, acting as if they had always seen greatness in her from the start. On stage and in magazines, the image was immaculate. Anita wrapped in satin gowns, every curl in place, every gesture deliberate. Her voice seemed to pour out like warm silk, steady and controlled, the soundtrack to romance, reunions, and late-night slow dances. But beyond the spotlight, the reality was far less smooth. The moment rapture caught fire, the machine around Anita accelerated into something brutal. There were tours stacked back to back, press appearances in city after city, photo shoots, interviews, label meetings, award ceremonies, and recording schedules so tight they seemed designed to crush sleep out of her life. She was 30 years old, celebrated across the country, and utterly exhausted. 2 years later, November 1988 arrived like another wave. Giving You the Best That I Got debuted and went triple platinum, 3 Grammy Awards in a single night. Unforgettable performances that left audiences stunned. Headlines began crowning her the Queen of Quiet Storm, as if her throne had always been waiting. Yet Anita herself would later admit that behind the scenes, behind the gowns and the applause, she was coming apart. The pressure to remain flawless, to always be soft, steady, gracious, pressed down on her like a weight she had never been trained to carry. The world wanted perfection, not humanity. Inside recording studios, her pursuit of that perfection became almost mythic and quietly frightening. Engineers from that era have described long nights where Anita would lock onto a single breath, a single vowel, a tiny bend at the end of a note. Tape reels piled up on the floor as she demanded take after take, long after everyone else in the room had mentally checked out. Some sessions ended near sunrise, with Anita alone in the control room, staring through the glass, rewinding a single line again and again until her voice frayed from overuse. From the outside, it looked like meticulous artistry. In truth, it was also self-defense. Every time she redid a phrase, she wasn't just chasing a perfect sound, she was fighting back against the echo of those executives who once said she wasn't a star. Every time she sang a chorus again, she wasn't simply correcting a note. She was bargaining with an industry that had already proven it could discard her whenever it chose. For fans, her voice was comfort. For Anita, it was armor and, increasingly, a cage. As the hits rolled on, compositions in 1990, Rhythm of Love in 1994, the demands only intensified. Elektra expected more records, more sales, more tours, more visibility. The machine did not slow down just because she was tired. And although Anita had fought so hard for creative independence, she found herself inside a different kind of prison, a major label system dominated by powerful men who decided how she should look, how she should be sold, who she should appeal to, and when her time might quietly be called over. The woman who had clawed her way out of one label's grip began to sense a familiar pattern tightening around her again. By 1995, tensions between Anita and Elektra were no longer whispers. She accused the label of failing to properly promote Rhythm of Love, despite its Grammy nominations and critical praise. In her view, they were deliberately sliding her to the side to make room for younger, more commercially attractive acts. Whether every detail of that belief was accurate didn't change the core reality for her. What mattered was how it felt like history looping back, like another corporate system quietly telling her she was no longer worth full investment. Another room, full of men, trying to choose her future without her consent. So Anita did what she had always done when backed into a corner. She fought. In 1996, she filed a lawsuit against Elektra demanding release from her contract and accusing the label of breaching its promotional obligations. It was her second major legal war in less than 10 years. Once again, Anita found herself in rooms she hated. Boardrooms lined with executives, conference tables stacked with documents, her entire career reduced to clauses and percentages. The irony cut deep. On stage, she poured out songs about connection, trust, and vulnerability. Off stage, She lived in near total isolation, surrounded more by lawyers and managers than by true confidants. The more the world praised her voice, the lonelier she became. Fans saw the magazine covers, the awards, the gold and platinum plaques. They did not see the migraines. They did not see the insomnia. They did not hear the silence of hotel rooms where she sat alone after shows, drained, shaking, trying to slow her heart rate before the next performance. They did not see the panic that sometimes gripped her before walking on stage, the fear that one misstep, one bad review, could be used as an excuse to push her aside. You do not outrun childhood abandonment. You simply bury it under achievement and hope it stays quiet. For Anita, it never did. By the mid-1990 seconds, the cracks beneath her golden era were yawning wider. The pressure she had carried for years, industry battles, perfectionism, isolation, was about to spill into her personal life with devastating force. The next chapter would not just test her as an artist, it would tear through her marriage, her finances, her public image, and her sense of self. And in that collision, Anita Baker would discover that awards look impressive on a wall, but they cannot hold you up when everything else is collapsing. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. There are falls in life that creep in slowly, one quiet fracture at a time. And then there are falls that arrive all at once, loud, public, and almost impossible to recover from. Anita Baker's descent into one of the darkest chapters of her life began like the first kind, a hairline crack behind a polished wall. By the time the world noticed, the entire structure around her was already crumbling. For nearly 2 decades, Anita had built what looked like a stable personal world with Walter Bridgeforth Jr., a man far removed from the ruthless pace of the music industry. Together, they raised 2 sons and built a home that, from the outside, seemed to glow with the domestic peace Anita had chased since childhood. For a while, the house held the illusion she had always wanted: routine, safety, family. But fame is a quiet intruder. It does not knock. It seeps in. It reshapes schedules, priorities, and even the way people speak to each other across the dinner table. By the early 2000s, the marriage was reportedly eroding into long silences and emotional distance. Different temperaments, different worlds, different kinds of pressure, all pulling in opposite directions. The woman who once sang "Giving You the Best That I Got" was now living inside a house where simple conversations started to feel like negotiations for temporary peace. By 2007, the facade could no longer hold. Divorce papers were filed. What Anita did not fully see coming was that this divorce would turn into one of the most painful, publicly humiliating, and financially dangerous battles of her life. During the proceedings, Walter's legal team argued that he was entitled to half of the royalties from 2 of Anita's most successful albums, "Giving You the Best," "That I Got 1,988, and "Rhythm of Love," 1,994. Not just future earnings, retroactive royalty payments as well. For Anita, who had fought so hard for creative control, ownership, and fair compensation, the demand reportedly felt like someone reaching into her chest and labeling pieces of her soul as divisible assets. The songs in question were not just tracks to her. They were the result of sleepless nights, strained vocal cords, studio breakdowns, and years of internal warfare. Now they were being itemized, split into percentages, and argued over in court. Legal documents, filings, and proposed orders framed her life's work in columns and dollar signs. The same songs she had poured herself into until her body gave out were now being used as bargaining chips. As the hearings dragged on, Anita became increasingly reluctant to sign certain documents she believed were inaccurate, unfair, or miscalculated. She asked for more time. She requested clarification. She pushed back on terms she felt were not properly explained. In her mind, she was protecting herself and the integrity of what she had built. In the court's view, it began to look like resistance, or worse, defiance. That is how the unthinkable crept in. In March 2010, a Michigan judge issued a bench warrant threatening Anita Baker with arrest on contempt of court charges for allegedly failing to comply with specific aspects of the divorce order. Overnight, headlines flared across news sites and entertainment blogs. Anita Baker faces possible jail time. Grammy-winning singer at risk of arrest. For a woman who had spent decades building an image of elegance and control, seeing her name linked to the possibility of being taken into custody over paperwork was a near-nightmare scenario. According to later accounts, Anita felt blindsided, as if the legal system had quietly turned her personal struggle into a public spectacle. But the storm was not finished. While she was still wrestling with the fallout from her divorce, another force stepped in: the United States government. According to reports, the IRS calculated that Anita owed more than $2 million in taxes, penalties, and interest debts tied to years of financial missteps, shifting accountants and advisors who, by some accounts, did not always protect her best interests. The same woman whose records had once ruled the Billboard charts now found herself staring at federal notices warning of liens, audits, and serious consequences. And as if that were not enough, another blow arrived. In 2014, it was reported that a group of contractors filed a lawsuit against her, claiming she failed to pay roughly $15,000 for home renovation work. Whether every detail of their claim was fair, exaggerated, or somewhere in between became irrelevant to the public. What mattered was the optics. Cameras showed up looking for quotes. Local reporters waited outside court buildings. Blogs spun short stories into long narratives. Social media treated her as entertainment instead of a person under siege. For someone as private and guarded as Anita, this was not just bad press, it was psychological assault. Under the weight of court battles, tax threats, mounting legal fees, and the collapse of her marriage, Anita did something that many fans misread. She began to vanish. She slowed down her public life. Then she almost stopped it. The performances grew fewer and farther apart. Recording output stalled. Interviews disappeared. Public sightings became rare enough to spark rumors whenever she was seen. Some fans speculated about health issues. Others blamed industry politics. Some simply assumed she had retired quietly. The truth, by many accounts, was far harsher. She was overwhelmed. This was not just a financial crisis. It was an emotional freefall. Anita had spent her entire life reaching for stability. She had always been terrified of being abandoned again. She had fought to hold on to the small circle of people she trusted. And now, in the span of a few years, the man she had shared a life with was demanding access to her royalties. The court system was threatening her freedom, the IRS was threatening her security, and the media was threatening her dignity. Everything she had built, her career, her home, her image, her sense of safety seemed to collapse like a sandcastle under a wave she never saw coming. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the noise, she struggled. She shut down contact. She cried more often than she sang. She replayed her decisions, second-guessing herself at every turn. The same perfectionist who once insisted on controlling every syllable in the studio now found herself unable to control even the basic framing of her own life in public. And there was a cruel irony at the center of it all. The woman whose music had soothed millions could not find a way to soothe herself. By the time this chapter of her life neared its end, Anita Baker was no longer the polished figure the world had framed in evening gowns and spotlight halos. She was a woman stripped raw, financially strained, emotionally battered, spiritually shaken. A mother trying to shield her children from fallout. A human being just trying to keep her head above water. But this is not where her story closes. Because legends do not stay broken. And Anita Baker, the abandoned child, the contract survivor, the woman who took on labels and walked away standing, was already, quietly, preparing to rise again. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. When Anita Baker surfaced again in the early 2010 seconds, it wasn't with the triumphant glow of a diva reclaiming her crown. It was quieter, more measured, like the first frame of a documentary flickering back to life after years of static. No big announcements. No grand declarations, just a woman edging cautiously back into the one place that had always both saved and haunted her: the studio. Around 2010, Anita slipped behind closed doors and began working on what would become, by many accounts, the most maddening project of her career: a new album titled Only Forever. No official track lists, no glossy teasers, just fragments of information and a handful of whispers from session musicians who claimed that her voice sounded deeper, richer, more lived-in than ever before. They described arrangements that were lush and orchestral, recordings that felt cinematic, tapes that, in their words, were nothing short of gold. It sounded like the kind of late-career masterpiece fans dream of. In 2012, she gave the world a glimpse. She released a single, Lately. Against all odds, in a youth-obsessed market, the song climbed to #1 on the adult R&B charts, a rare accomplishment for someone so far into their career arc. Fans assumed Only Forever was just weeks away. Weeks turned into months. Months stretched into years. And the album never came. Only Forever seemed to vanish, not into thin air, but into the quiet machinery of the industry. A ghost project trapped somewhere between corporate filing cabinets and private negotiations. Fans waited for explanations that never really arrived. Behind that silence, Anita was dealing with a nightmare few listeners knew about. According to reports, the problem was not writer's block or creative doubt. It was ownership. Somewhere in the fine print, in decades-old contracts and buried clauses, Anita realized something devastating: the label still owned her masters, the original recordings of her life's work. Those masters were the reason her royalty streams did not look like they should have. They were the reason Only Forever kept stalling. They were the invisible chains binding her to a system that had used those same tactics on generations of black artists before her. By 2017, the frustration appeared to reach a boiling point. Anita abruptly announced that she was retiring. To the outside world, it looked like surrender, a tired legend stepping back for good. But in hindsight, it resembled something else: a strategic pause. The calm, eerie stillness before a counterattack. Then came 2018. Anita Baker returned to the stage. Not as a constant presence, not as a media fixture, but as a force. The shows felt like resurrection rituals. Fans saw a woman who seemed both fragile and unbreakable, standing in front of crowds who still knew every word. On the surface, it looked like a simple comeback tour. In reality, it was groundwork. She was rebuilding leverage, reassembling her audience, reminding the industry that her name still filled seats, that her catalog still had weight, and that whoever controlled her masters was sitting on a fortune. What came next was not a ballad or an album. It was a series of tweets. In 2021, Anita took her fight public in the most direct way possible. On Twitter, in plain, unvarnished language, she began to lay out what she said had been happening behind the scenes. She accused Warner, Elektra, of withholding royalties, of controlling her catalog through outdated contracts, of continuing to profit off work they no longer even actively promoted. She stunned fans and industry observers when she wrote, "They no longer own my name and likeness." Then another message. Her masters were more than 30 years old, and she insisted they needed to be returned to her. And then came the tweet that shook everything. A request to her supporters: do not stream my music. She claimed she was receiving no payments from those streams. In that moment, the famously private, soft-spoken Anita Baker became an unmistakable figurehead for one of the music industry's ugliest realities: the fact that legendary artists often do not own the very work that made them legendary. Critics, commentators, and some fans pushed back quickly. They called her difficult, unreasonable, ungrateful. Some suggested she was misreading contracts or exaggerating. But Anita did not fold. Each tweet was a carefully placed strike. Each update felt like another blow landed against a machine that had once expected her to remain quiet and compliant. While social media argued over her tone, timing, and temperament, Anita was doing something far more consequential behind closed doors. Teams of attorneys were believed to be combing through her agreements line by line. Negotiations unfolded in private rooms and on conference calls. Executives who once viewed her as a nostalgic figure suddenly had to treat her as a live threat, a woman willing to bring her grievances into the public square. Then, in September 2021, The tone shifted. Anita posted a photograph. No glam shot, no performance still, just a signed legal document resting on a wooden table, no dramatic caption, no rant, just 2 words that crashed through the silence like thunder. It's done. After more than 3 decades, Anita Baker had finally regained full ownership of her master recordings. It was a victory rare enough to put her alongside names like Prince and Taylor Swift, artists who were widely known for waging war against the corporate structures that held their catalogs hostage. But Anita's win carried an extra layer of significance. She was a black woman in her 60s, facing down an entrenched corporate system that had quietly underestimated her for years. She was not supposed to win. She was not expected to push this hard, this long, but she did. When she returned to the stage in 2022, something remarkable happened. At one of her shows, the screens behind her lit up with 2 simple words: "Masters returned." The crowd didn't just cheer, they roared, as if watching the final scene of a long, grueling investigation finally click into place. This wasn't about vanity, ego, or greed. It was about liberation. About a woman reclaiming pieces of herself that had been treated as corporate property for more than half of her life. In that moment, Anita Baker became more than a vocalist, more than a beloved R&B figure. She became a frontline soldier in a generational battle over artistic ownership. Her catalog was no longer just inventory. It was no longer collateral locked in a corporate vault. It was hers. Every note, every breath, every tear-stained take, the masters had finally come home. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. The cruelest twist in Anita Baker's story did not come from a record label, a courtroom, or a government office. It came from a generation that did not grow up with her music, did not understand her scars, and did not particularly care to learn them. It came from a world where a single tweet can weigh more than 40 years of work. And it began on a tour that was supposed to honor everything she had survived. In 2023, Anita announced the Songstress Tour 40, a celebration of 4 decades of artistry, resilience, and reinvention. For longtime fans, it felt like a blessing, a chance to say thank you in person, to stand in the same room with the woman whose songs had scored their breakups, their weddings, their late-night drives. On paper, it looked like a victory lap, but instead of a smooth farewell, the tour quickly morphed into the setting for the harshest backlash of her public life. The turning point came at the New Jersey show on the 10th of May 2023. That night, Babyface, her special guest and a legend in his own right, was, according to later accounts, unexpectedly asked not to perform. The audience waited, restless and confused, as the house lights dimmed and then brightened again with no clear explanation. Hours later, while Anita was still on stage, Babyface posted a brief message to his followers. He apologized to fans and wrote that he had been asked not to perform so that Miss Baker could have her space and time. 21 words. That was all it took. Within minutes, those words ignited a cultural firestorm. His supporters, loyal, vocal, and deeply protective, poured into the comments. They flooded Anita's social media with anger, accusations, and demands. Some framed her as jealous. Others said she was insecure, controlling, unable to share the spotlight. Almost no one paused to ask for context. No one waited to hear her side in full. The verdict was delivered in real time on timelines and comment sections. For a woman who had spent her career fighting to protect her space from predatory contracts, from manipulative executives, from exploitative systems, the accusation that she was selfishly hoarding, it landed like a blade. Anita responded publicly, the only way she could, in the age of digital scrutiny. She referred to some of Babyface's most aggressive supporters as Kenny's crazies, a phrase that instantly took on a life of its own online. It was clipped, reposted, memed, and twisted until it was used as ammunition against her. The online attacks escalated beyond criticism into open hostility. Anita posted that she was receiving verbal abuse, harassment, and even threats of violence. She wrote that people were targeting her daily, calling her names, accusing her of sabotaging Babyface's shine. It became clear she was not just dealing with one artist or one miscommunication. She was facing the full, merciless force of stan culture, algorithms, and the internet's hunger for spectacle. Then came the decision that locked in the narrative. Overwhelmed and increasingly concerned for her safety and peace of mind, Anita removed Babyface from the remaining tour dates. In the court of public opinion, that move sealed her fate. To many on social media, Anita Baker became the villain of the story. Headlines painted her as difficult, temperamental, unwilling to share the stage. Comment sections called her bitter. Younger audiences, unfamiliar with her history, dismissed her as overrated or out of touch. No one seemed interested in the decades she had spent battling exploitation, trauma, anxiety, and pressure. Few cared that she had been pushed into a corner by constant online harassment. What mattered most was the drama, and Anita was the easiest person to cast as the antagonist. Just weeks later, another incident poured fuel on the fire. At a Houston tour stop, Anita tried to enforce a simple boundary. No bright phone flashes in her face while she performed. She reportedly asked venue staff to escort out an attendee who refused to comply. The moment was filmed, clipped, and uploaded within hours. Stripped of context, the footage was shared as evidence that she was rude and ungrateful. Short videos of her asking for basic respect were edited into narratives of her attacking fans. The clips spread, fast and brutal. The story hardened. Anita Baker was an aging diva, hostile to modern audiences, unworthy of the legend's status. Older fans insisted she deserved. The tragedy of this chapter lies in what people did not see. They saw a veteran performer irritated with phones. They saw a dispute with Babyface. They saw tension, attitude, and boundaries presented as arrogance. They did not see the weight that settled on Anita's shoulders every time she walked on stage. The anxiety that comes with rows of cameras pointed at your face, ready to capture every blink and breath. The insecurity that never fully left her after a childhood marked by abandonment. The quiet terror of being a 60-plus-year-old black woman performing in a culture obsessed with youth, speed, and spectacle. They did not see the vulnerability under the stage lights. They did not hear the tremor of fear beneath the applause. The internet is not built to reward nuance. It is built to amplify noise. In the ruthless logic of the streaming era, context barely matters. History barely matters. 40 years of work can be overshadowed by a single post, a single clip, a single out-of-context quote. Anita Baker, the woman who once faced down labels, executives, lawsuits, and corporate giants, found herself facing something even more intangible and unforgiving. A crowd of strangers, armed with smartphones, with no incentive to understand her story. That is the cruelty of the modern age. Legends are not carefully remembered. They are rapidly judged, not in thoughtful articles or long-form interviews, but in comments, memes, and viral snippets. And yet, even in the middle of this storm, Anita Baker's story refuses to end on a note of defeat. She has survived what would have broken many artists early on. Being abandoned as a child, being orphaned twice, being told she had no star power, signing contracts that nearly buried her, fighting labels in court, winning her freedom only to face financial ruin, enduring public humiliation, health scares, threats, and the brutal glare of online backlash. Through all of it, she is still here, with her voice, with her legacy, with her master recordings finally back under her own name. So now the question shifts away from boardrooms, headlines, and social media feeds and lands in your hands. After everything you've seen and heard about Anita Baker's journey, how should she really be remembered? As the difficult diva the internet painted her to be? Or as the abandoned child who turned her wound into a soundtrack, the survivor who fought systems most people never even see, the artist who refused to give away the rights to her own soul? That answer does not belong to labels, courts, or trending topics. It belongs to the people who have lived with her music and to those who are just discovering the story behind that voice. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.